Calvin Broom was 38 years old the night he heard his wife say the words that changed the shape of everything. He had been in the hallway outside the kitchen, still in his work boots, still carrying the particular quietness that settled over him after a long day on a job site. He was a civil engineer by training and a site supervisor by practice, and he moved through spaces the way men who spend their days reading structural drawings move through them, noticing load points, identifying stress, registering what was holding and what was not. He noticed things. He had always noticed things. It was not a choice. It was the way he was built. Denise was on the phone. Her voice was low and certain and carrying the specific warmth she reserved for her sister Cheryl, who lived in Richmond and who had never, in 6 years of the marriage, given Calvin any particular reason to trust her. She said, "He has no idea. Soon it's all mine." Then she laughed. It was a small laugh, practiced in private. The laugh of someone who believed the room was empty. The room was not empty. Calvin stood in the hallway for 7 seconds. He counted them without deciding to. He looked down at the boots he had not yet removed, steel-toed, worn at the heel, bought 3 years ago at a workwear supply store on the south side of Memphis, and he made a decision so quiet it barely registered as a decision at all. He backed out of the hallway. He sat on the front steps. He looked at the house he had designed the structural modifications for with his own hands, the house whose foundation he had reinforced the spring after they bought it. And he understood, with the precision of a man who read blueprints for a living, that what he had just heard was not a beginning. It was a confirmation. What Denise did not know, what Cheryl did not know, what the man Denise had been meeting on the 3rd Tuesday of every month did not know, was that Calvin Broom had been watching the structure for 11 months, and that the document he had opened on his laptop the previous February and named simply Foundation contained enough material to end this, cleanly, legally, and completely. What happened next would cost Denise every assumption she had ever made about what she was standing on. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Memphis in late October had a particular quality to its mornings, a low gray light that came in sideways through windows, not warm, not cold, carrying the smell of river and leaf rot and something older underneath both of those things. Calvin had lived in Memphis for 12 years, since his first job out of graduate school with a firm that did infrastructure work for the county, and he had never fully stopped noticing the city the way newcomers noticed it, with a kind of measured attention that felt slightly separate from belonging. He was at the kitchen table by 5:30 most mornings, coffee in hand, reviewing site drawings or procurement schedules, or the particular knot of a problem that had been waiting for him since the previous afternoon. He worked for himself now, a small civil engineering firm he had founded 4 years ago with a partner named Dwight, who handled the business development while Calvin handled the technical work, which was the arrangement both of them had agreed suited their respective temperaments. The firm had 6 employees, a solid reputation in municipal infrastructure work, and 3 active contracts with the city of Memphis worth a combined $1.4 million. None of that appeared on the lanyard he wore on job sites, which said only C. Broom, Supervisor, because Calvin had never seen the purpose in broadcasting what you held. His grandfather used to say, "The foundation does the work. Nobody praises the foundation. That's how you know it's doing its job." He had thought about that sentence the entire first year he ran his own company, when the work was hard, and the recognition was minimal, and the accounts were thinner than he had projected. He had kept building anyway. That was the only thing to do with a foundation. He had met Denise at a city planning meeting 5 years before they married. She was working as a community liaison for a nonprofit that advocated for infrastructure improvements in South Memphis neighborhoods, which meant she understood, at least in the language of her work, the value of what Calvin did. He had been drawn to her directness and her knowledge and the way she spoke in public forums without performing for them. He had courted her carefully. He had married her at 31 in a ceremony at a small church in Cordova, attended by 40 people. He had built the structural modifications on the house himself on weekends over the first spring of their marriage, reinforced the crawl space, replaced the original support beams with engineered lumber, re-leveled the floor in the back bedroom that had been settling for years. He had done it the way he did all physical work, methodically, without rushing, checking each stage before moving to the next. Denise had called it his love language. She had said it warmly at the time. He had believed her. That was before the new perfume she never mentioned. Before the third Tuesdays. Before the phone she set face down with a reflex that looked practiced. Before the conversation with Cheryl that he had not been meant to hear and had heard anyway. He had noticed all of it. He had documented none of it yet. That was about to change. He began the way he began every complex project, with a site assessment. In engineering, you did not respond to a structural problem by immediately opening walls. You started with the observable evidence. You mapped what you could see from the outside. You built a picture of what was likely happening inside based on the symptoms presenting on the surface. And then you found the access point that would give you the clearest view of what was actually there. He pulled the joint bank statements on a Wednesday night, while Denise was at what she described as a committee meeting. He had her on the shared account, had added her 4 years ago as a practical measure when they bought the house together. He had never examined the statements with this kind of attention before. He did now. The pattern emerged in the third month back. Small withdrawals, irregular in amount but consistent in timing, always within a 2-day window of the third Tuesday. Cash advances at ATMs he did not recognize in parts of the city that bore no relationship to Denise's described routines. 3 wire transfers over 8 months to an account he did not recognize, totaling $19,400, with memo lines that read variously home repairs, medical, a category of expense she had never once discussed with him. His hands did not shake. He photographed every page. He forwarded the files to the private account. He opened a spreadsheet and built a timeline, dates, amounts, account numbers. Memo notes, with the same structural logic he applied to material quantity estimates on job sites. When you laid it all out in sequence, the shape of it became undeniable. She had been moving money for at least 8 months, probably longer. The pattern was too established, too calibrated, to be new. He went back 14 months and found the first one. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned back to the screen. He needed the other half of the picture. The money was moving toward something. In engineering, water did not move without a gradient. There was always a destination. He needed to find it. He spent the next 4 evenings doing what he was trained to do, reading what the evidence told him without asking it to say something different. By the following Monday, he had traced the receiving account through a cross-reference of property filings in Shelby County, a skill he had developed over years of reviewing site ownership documents for municipal contracts, and found a name attached to a newly formed LLC that had filed a leasehold improvement permit on a commercial property in Midtown 3 months prior. The name on the permit was Derek Sims. He recognized it. Denise had mentioned Derek Sims once, 14 months ago, as a childhood friend who had moved back to Memphis from Nashville. She had said it the way you say something you are choosing to say in order to have said it. He opened a new folder on his laptop. He named it Foundation. Then he made a single phone call. Claudette Marsh had been a family law and asset protection attorney for 22 years, practicing out of an office on Union Avenue with a reputation that had been built entirely on the accuracy of her assessments and the completeness of her preparation. She did not take cases she could not win cleanly. She did not make promises she could not document. She met Calvin the following Thursday morning, reviewed what he set in front of her for 20 minutes without speaking, and said, "You did this yourself?" He said, "I read site surveys for a living. This is a site survey." She said, "It's more than that." She set down the last page. The LC connection is significant. If your money was used to capitalize a business venture with a third party during the marriage, that constitutes dissipation of marital assets. The question is how much is documentable and how far back we can establish intent. Calvin told her about the phone call in the hallway. The exact words. She wrote them down. She said, "That sentence, if you heard it clearly and can testify to it, establishes awareness of concealment. It's not a small thing." She told him what she needed. He told her he would have it within a week. He had it in 4 days. He drove to Germantown on a Saturday afternoon to see his Aunt Bee. Beatrice Broom was 67 years old, had raised Calvin from 14 after his mother's illness, and had a way of looking at a situation that removed everything unnecessary from it, until only the essential remained. She was a retired school principal who had spent 30 years teaching people, children, and adults equally, the difference between what they felt and what was actually true, and the difference between those two things and what they were going to do about it. She made him sit down. She made him eat something. Then she said, "Talk." He talked. She listened the way she always listened, without interruption, without expression, filing everything. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known something was wrong?" 11 months. "The full shape of it?" 3 weeks. "And you've been going to work and coming home and eating dinner?" "Yes." She looked at him. "That took something." "It took what it took," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather had a saying. You've heard it." He nodded. "The foundation does the work." "He meant it about more than construction," she said. "He meant it about men, the ones who hold, the ones you don't see cracking. They're the ones everything else stands on." She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his. "You've been the foundation of that house in every way there is." She was standing on you. She just forgot what that meant. He drove back to Memphis with the clarity he had come for. He had one more thing to build before this was over. What Claudette's associate found in the 3 weeks that followed added a dimension to the picture that Calvin had not anticipated. Derek Sims had a business history that extended beyond the Midtown LLC. 2 prior ventures in Nashville, both of which had involved a female partner whose assets had been folded into the operating capital and who had exited the arrangement with substantially less than she had entered with. Neither case had resulted in criminal charges. Both had produced civil judgments that Sims had satisfied partially and then closed through strategic bankruptcy. He operated, Claudette's associate concluded in a written summary, as someone who identified partners with accessible resources and structured his involvement to capture those resources before the partner understood the nature of the arrangement. Denise had not started this calculation alone. Calvin sat with that information for 2 days before he decided what to do with it. He was not angry. He was something colder and more useful than anger. He was precise. He was an engineer looking at a failed structure and identifying every point of failure simultaneously, without sentiment, without the need to assign blame in a way that interfered with the technical assessment. He went home that Wednesday evening and made dinner. Grilled chicken, rice, a salad. Denise came home at 7 and ate with him and talked about her day and asked about his and he answered with the same measured attention he had given her for 6 years. He cleared the dishes. He asked her if she wanted coffee. She said yes. He made it. He handed her the mug. He thought about his grandfather's foundation, invisible, load-bearing, doing its work in the dark beneath everything that appeared solid and deliberate above it. He was almost done. Claudette scheduled the mediation for a Tuesday. Calvin noted the date without ceremony. Denise arrived at the mediation suite with her attorney, a man named Briggs, whose confidence, when he entered the room, was the kind that comes from not yet having read what is waiting on the other side of the table. She wore a blazer he did not recognize, and she sat with the posture of someone who believed she had the stronger position, which was a position she had constructed over months of planning, and which had felt solid to her because she had not known what the actual foundation was. She looked at Calvin once when she sat down. He looked back at her with an expression that gave her nothing, and she looked away. Claudette set the first document in the center of the table. It was the timeline. 14 months of withdrawals, transfers, and ATM activity, mapped against Denise's described schedule and cross-referenced against the property records that connected each transaction to the Midtown LLC. Every number sourced, every date verified, the kind of document that could have been submitted as a project completion report to a municipal planning office, clean, structured, irrefutable. Briggs picked it up. He put it down. He picked it up again. Claudette set down the second document. It was Claudette's associate's summary of Derek Sims's business history in Nashville. The 2 prior ventures, the civil judgments, the pattern. She said calmly, "Your client's co-conspirator has done this before. The good news for your client is that this information is potentially mitigating. The bad news is that it establishes a pattern that a court will find relevant to intent." Denise's expression shifted. It was not guilt, not immediately. It was the expression of someone watching a structure they believed they had built discover that it was standing on someone else's ground. She said, "Calvin, just his name." She said it the way you say the name of a person you have underestimated and are only now fully seeing. He looked at her. Claudette set down the third document. It was a transcript, notarized, of Calvin's written account of the hallway conversation, the exact words, the date, the time, the context. The page was short. It did not need to be long. Briggs read it. He set it down. He said something quietly to Denise that Calvin could not hear. Denise said, "I didn't mean." She stopped. She tried again. "The way it sounds is not what it was," Calvin said. "I know what it was, Denise. I've known what it was for 11 months. I'm not here to argue about it." He paused. "I'm here because this is the cleanest way to end it. And you know me well enough to know I do things the cleanest way." She did know that. That was, he thought, perhaps the one true thing that had survived intact. Briggs asked for a recess. They took 20 minutes. When they came back, the tone in the room had changed in the way that rooms change when one side has understood the full picture and is now engaged in damage limitation rather than advancement. The settlement negotiation lasted 2 hours. What Denise received was a fair accounting of the genuinely marital assets, a number Claudette had calculated, and Calvin had accepted without protest, because fairness had never been his objection. What she did not receive was any claim against the firm, whose founding documents predated the marriage by 8 months, and whose ownership structure had been maintained separately throughout. The $19,400 in documented transfers was treated as dissipation and offset against her distribution. The Midtown LLC, tied as it was to the Sims matter and its documented history, was referred to the district attorney's office for a separate review that was not Calvin's initiative and not his responsibility. He walked out of the building at 12:41 in the afternoon. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He had left his truck 2 blocks away. He walked to it slowly, without hurry, and the way he moved through all spaces, noticing load points, identifying what was holding and what was not. He was holding. 16 months later, Calvin sat on the back porch of the house in Memphis, in the particular gray light of a late October morning that he had come to think of as the city's truest version of itself. He had repoured the back porch foundation that summer. Not because it had failed. The work he had done in the first spring was still sound, would remain sound for decades, but because the porch itself had settled slightly to one side in a way that was cosmetically imperfect. And he had a standard for the work he put his name on that he applied to everything he built without negotiation. He had done it over 3 weekends in July, alone and unhurried, and the result was level and clean and would outlast him. The firm had taken on a 4th municipal contract in the spring, bridge assessment work for the county, the kind of steady infrastructure engagement that Dwight said positioned them well for a state-level opportunity they were watching. Calvin had hired 2 more engineers in September. He had begun mentoring a recent graduate from the University of Memphis, whose attention to detail reminded him of himself at that age, which he found quietly satisfying in the way that passing something forward was always satisfying. A woman named Renee had come into his life 8 months ago through Aunt B, who had introduced them at a family gathering with the specific casualness of someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing. Renee was a structural architect who worked on adaptive reuse projects, old industrial buildings converted to residential or commercial use, and she approached problems with the patience and precision of someone who had learned to read old buildings for what they were trying to say. She understood the language he thought in. He had found that rarer than he expected. She was in the kitchen now, behind him, and he could hear the sound of her moving in the space with the ease of someone who had decided to be comfortable in it. He had heard about Denise through a colleague who had worked adjacent to her nonprofit years ago. She had left Memphis. She was in Nashville, which carried its own particular weight given what he knew about Derek Sims's history there, though that was a coincidence he registered and set down. Sims had been named in a civil complaint filed by the district attorney's office that had nothing to do with Calvin, and that was proceeding on its own timeline toward its own resolution. Denise had cooperated, apparently. What that had cost her professionally and socially was not something he had sought to know. Cheryl had not called since before the mediation. He drank his coffee. The morning light settled into the yard he had landscaped the previous spring. A Japanese persimmon he had planted along the south fence line, 2 raised beds of late-season greens, a ground cover along the porch edge that Renee had selected, and that was, she had promised him, nearly indestructible. He believed her. He had learned to distinguish between things that were built to last and things that were built to look like they would last, and the difference was in the foundation. And the foundation was always the part that nobody praised until it failed, and his had not failed, and he did not expect it to. His grandfather had been right about most things. The foundation does the work. He had done the work. He was solvent. He was steady. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, exactly where he had built himself to stand. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.